So I'm at University of Chester. I started studying in 2015 and I started with a BA and then an MA. And as the BA was coming to an end, with a ridiculous level of confidence, I decided I would apply for the CAS grant for 2018. And I wanted to look at the artefacts for the early medieval period in Cheshire. I met Peter's Winning Carrington of all characters to be interviewed about my proposal in a garden centre when we were allowed out to such places as that. And 3 people very kindly or foolishly provided references for me. And that's why we're here today. And why the early medieval period? Well, my undergraduate dissertation was a reappraisal of prone burials in early Anglo-Saxon graves. And I saw a lot of the material culture from the time, some of which is really lovely. So I welcome the chance to take the study further and for my local area. So this evening, I just plan to give a very brief outline of the survey by considering the sort of 3 sub-periods within the early medieval period and the finds that define these, then to look at the evidence for Viking activity in Cheshire, and finally to look at one possible productive site in particular. So at the time of writing, and I'm using records, not objects like Heather was, there were 119 records on the database for Cheshire, but I excluded the Huxley hoard, which had already been published by Graham Campbell and Philpott in 2009, and the 9 coins. In retrospect, that was a bit short-sighted, and I would include the coins if I started again, as they add particularly to an analysis of possible productive sites, as well as offering dating evidence. I categorised the finds by time period in line with the PAS, which splits the early medieval period into 3 sub-periods, early, middle and late, a bit confusingly. And the temporal distribution, as we'll see, was biased towards the later part, but there were still enough finds to suggest significant activity throughout the early medieval Cheshire. The geographical distribution was reasonably even across the county, with a few exceptions. For example, built-up areas such as Chester itself don't attract metal detectorists, and in the Peak District National Park in the east of the county, detecting is prohibited. So the temporal distribution, it's not possible to date all of the objects suggested by the PAS. For example, gaming pieces look much the same throughout the period, as do spindle whorls and many of the pins. A much more detailed analysis of these items is required to better allocate them to the sub-periods, and maybe that's something somebody could take up for a project one day. Generally, of what can be dated, as already stated, there's a bias towards the later part, AD 850 onwards. But that's mainly because of the large numbers of strap ends and equestrian equipment. All are later introductions, and it's a phenomenon not limited to Cheshire, it's countrywide. They're also the kind of items which presumably were easily lost and not immediately noticed. If you consider discounting these kind of bulk items, it puts the bias in a less dramatic light, in fairness. So looking at the early medieval period first, some of the finds are shown here. Sleeve clasps, such as this one here, are almost exclusively known from grave contexts in the south and east of England. There are 2 sets from Shropshire, but even so, they're very rare finds this far west. And also, because they were an imported fashion with the Anglo-Saxons, short-lived and seemingly not adopted at all by Britons, they're a secure indication of early Anglo-Saxon activity in Cheshire. The same applies to the radiate-headed brooch. Penannular brooches, in contrast, are found across a broad period from Iron Age through. They're well distributed across Britain. The little bowl escutcheon down here, that's probably a little waterfowl inside view, is a bit of a mystery. It's got no parallels either on the database nor in Bruce Mitford's sort of seminal work on these artefacts, but many of these originate in Hiberno-Norse workshops, and it's likely this one did too. They're considered to be high status items. They're found, for example, in the Sutton Hoo Mound 1 burial. And I noticed while preparing this talk that another one has been found more recently, this time in the form of a horse's head at Rushden near Tarpley. The buckle too is kind of most often found in graves from which context it can be securely dated. So the scarcity of finds from the middle of the period is just offset by their magnificence. All 3 of them are treasure cases. 2 of them only are shown here. on this page, the pectoral cross is one of the few examples of its kind in Britain. Sam Lucy noted only 5 of these in 2016. And the most famous example is the St Cuthbert cross found on Cuthbert's body on one of the times it was moved and reinterred. Our example should have 4 plaques, 4 gold plaques, 1 on each arm, decorated with gold filigree, however one is missing. The centre as well probably held a jewel, maybe even a garnet. So it does share some styling similarities with Cuthbert's cross, particularly in the shape of the arms. It's been acquired by Nantwich Museum, and I'm pleased to say it's recently been exhibited there. The sword pommel cap is of cast silver and gilded, and it shows 2 entwined animals on each side. When it exhibited recently at the Grosvenor Museum, who acquired it as part of the PAS Treasure exhibition, it was described as arguably the finest object of the Saxon period ever found in Cheshire. It's quite hard to disagree, really. The final item that can be considered to originate in this mid-period is the hoard discovered in Marbury, which came just in time for inclusion in the survey. Also a treasure case. In the hoard are 3 silver brooches, the most complete one is shown here, as well as other brooch fragments, a coin of Wiglaf of Mercia, which dates from AD 830 to 40, a total of 24 items. The brooches are decorated in the Trewiddle style, and this style of decoration has been found also in the Galloway hoard, and the hoard that was found in Nannock in North Wales. And it suggests, as Heather says on the PAS, an interesting northwestern group for this style of decoration. So there's so many finds from the later part of the early medieval period. I'm just going to show a couple of examples. Strap ends can be amazing little bits of artwork. I really like them. And this one on the database is a treasure case because of the 2 silver rivets that are still in place in it. And these would have created an image of a Trewiddle style animal with glowing silver eyes. And you can imagine that as the wearer moved and the addition of the black and yellow that would have highlighted part of the pattern would have created quite a good effect. That's been acquired by Congleton Museum. And it's a shame really that the ubiquity of these objects just mean that they're often sold on the internet for a couple of pounds or so and probably not recorded on the PAS, which is a great loss. The book fitting is open in this area here that's filled with sort of soil residue, and that would have fitted over the edge of the book. And a hook that would have been here on the end and the perforated hole would also have been used to tie the book closed. And these are quite difficult to date because they're often reused on later books. So Vikings, we know there's a lot of evidence for Viking presence in Cheshire, so it's not a surprise really that some of the artefacts were from the Viking period. The hexagonal bells of this type are usually called Norse bells. They've been found in Acton as well as Bickley, Chester and Nantwich, and the dates assigned to them range from 800 AD to 1100. The one shown here is the only one in Cheshire with an intact loop, which in turn means that it's a type 2. The rarest of the types, representing only about 10% of those found. They were probably ornamental dress items found mainly in female grave assemblages, and they're also probably high status as have been found in the most richly furnished Viking age graves in Iceland. They seem to have been a symbol of identity that was adopted particularly in the Danelaw area, but they're also found in the Irish Sea region, and their uniformity makes their actual origin difficult to pinpoint. As most of these have been found through metal detecting activity, it's an illustration of the important role that detectors can play, as it's only by finding more and recording them that we can ascertain their exact origin. 4 sort of Viking weights have been found in Cheshire as well, all of the same construction but in different forms. They're lead with an inlaid copper alloy sheet, which has usually been cut down from a larger amount or something similar. The other 3 weights were found in Alvanley, Chester and Mere. Again, these reflect both the Irish Sea and Danelaw Scandinavian people, as they utilise different systems of weights, and both of these systems are represented by these finds. So the surprise here is not that Vikings were present in Cheshire, but they were not exclusively Irish sheep, but also from the Danelaw. This spoked strap distributor is my favourite item. It's made of copper alloy, and it's got a domed glass central setting. Each of these terminals here on the spokes are animal heads, as are these clasps, of which 2 survive. They were common in Scandinavia at the time, although the glass does suggest again a Hiberno-Norse connection. So these aren't the only examples of Viking culture artefacts found, but they do suggest both Danelaw and Irish Sea Scandinavian presence in Cheshire. And the evidence for widespread Viking activity is also supported by the Marbury and Huxley hoard and other small deposits, including silver ingots. So productive sites were first discussed widely following the boom in metal detecting in the late 20th century. And they're defined as areas not in which production takes place, but which are productive for metal detectorists in particular, as well as archaeologists. In the original appraisal of these sites by Pestel and Umschneider, mainly in the east of England, the finds that signalled such a site could number in the hundreds. In the survey, I listed 14 possible productive sites, but with the relative scarcity of finds in this part of Britain, it's a very arbitrary classification. The area with most finds is Huxley, and these are shown here. So the buckle in the top left, for example, might have had an inlaid gold and garnet decoration. It's very similar to one from Hampshire that is decorated like that. Strap end on the bottom row has an animal mask at the end of it, and it's one of the earliest types found anywhere. So that's interesting again this far west. This strap end here is of a type popular in the Carolingian continent as well as in Scandinavia. And this stirrup mount fits at the point where the leather strap meets the stirrup, and it's got a lion-like figure biting into the form above its head, if you can see the lines biting there. And it's likely that Viking settlers introduced the metal stirrup that these pieces go on. So this collection spans all of the early medieval period and demonstrates Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian and Carolingian art forms, all far to the west of what is usually thought of the sphere of Anglo-Saxon influence. So why Huxley? Well, it's near to a conjectured Roman road, possibly running from Chester to Whitchurch, and Tatton Hall, which is only 3 kilometres away, was founded in the Roman period. The Gowie and the Mersey rivers, the Gowie passes Huxley, also provided access to Mells at the time of Viking settlement and of course to the wider sea routes. There's a suggestion too that the Huxley hoard is linked to the Querdale hoard, which is of similar date and was found in Lancashire, in that they were both buried on routes to access the sea from whence she could sail for Dublin. And it's thought that the Querdale hoard, certainly, and possibly the Huxley hoard, was put there as a sort of war chest for Vikings who wanted to fund their reclaiming of Dublin. So if you plot the finds, the find locations for Huxley, and there's 10 here because I now have superior access to the database and realise there's 10 finds in Huxley, not 7, which is the only error I've made that I know of. If you plot these, you can see that 8 of these finds form a very distinct central cluster. And it could be the case that this is the only field for which permission has been granted for metal detecting. But there's a 15th century moated hall there, which may have been built on the site of an earlier settlement. And the field, as we've already said, adjoins the River Gowie, which suggests access to a routeway. And it could be that there's something else happening here. It could be a site of exchange or a settlement, maybe. And this type of mapping is something that I'm interested in taking a bit further. So about the grant itself, I must admit that I was really naive about what a project like this involved. And I guess Peter had quite a laugh about my financial forecast for the cost of the project, because for some reason I thought I'd be travelling all over the place looking at artefacts, having x-rays taken of the Cheshire artefacts and so on. Peter guided me towards a much more sensible but still over-ambitious forecast. There were other hazards along the way too. The university had taught me to write, but writing for a journal is a completely different thing altogether, as you all know. So I'd mastered correct referencing at university, although some might disagree about that, but I hadn't come across the beast that is signpost for archaeological publication, for example, and I knew nothing of a British standard for writing. And the thing is, all this is a very valuable learning process that's really part of the Chester Archaeological Society grant. It's given me some confidence in my ability, and I'm pleased to say that I've now expanded and deepened this study to cover the Welsh Marches area, of course, including Cheshire, in what I hope will eventually result in a PhD. So in a very real way, this grant from Cheshire Archaeological Society has helped me to develop really very much in my archaeological career. So I'd just like to say thank you to the committee and to Peter especially, who was very patient with the novice. Thanks also to Heather, somebody else who was very patient with me and is still being very patient with me. She gives me comprehensive and crucial insights into the workings of the PAS. And finally, to my PhD supervisors, who both read parts of this survey in preparation and continue to support me massively in my endeavours. And as Rachel said, I'm very sorry about the current situation at Chester, and I wholeheartedly hope they'll be around for many years to come. But back to the grant, I cannot recommend it highly enough as an educational tool and a way to contribute to real archaeology. And thank you.